Hi, I'm Carys.
And I'm Em Hilton, and you're listening to Over the Top and Under the Radar.
A weekly look at the stories in the news being overreported and those flying completely under the radar and not being talked about enough. My co-host this week is the brilliant Em Hilton. Em is a writer, organiser and strategist. She co-founded NAMOD, which is a movement of Jews in the UK that campaigns for the end of Israel's occupation and apartheid. And she works for Diaspora Alliance, which is an organisation that challenges anti-Semitism and its distortion around the world. Em, thank you so much for joining me. I'm so
Thank you
excited
for
to have you on the
having
show.
me. Yeah, it's really great to be here, Carys, and I'm very excited for our different subjects today to be talking about.
Yeah, we almost have like too many things. We did talk about potentially talking about people that run marathons. That's not going to make the cut.
No, absolutely.
Um,
Although I
yeah,
do have
there's.
some theories about men in their 30s who run marathons, including my husband.
Oh, I didn't know he runs marathons. Okay,
Yes. Yeah.
right,
We'll
right.
leave it
Are
there.
we
No comment.
okay? Yeah, no comment. No comment necessary. That's not part of this week's digest. You're like, tell us a little bit about how you ended up co-founding Namod, ended up doing the job that you're doing.
Yeah, so NAMOD was started in 2018 after the Great March of Return when in Palestine and Gaza, when Israel shot 52 Palestinians who were marching peacefully towards the separation barrier in Gaza. And we decided that enough was enough and we needed our community to take a stronger stance on ending support for Israeli occupation. We now obviously talk about Israeli occupation, apartheid, and genocide. And we are a collective of Jewish people around the UK who take part in direct action. We run campaigns, we run community events, and we're really part of not only building a world where all people are free, including Palestinians and Israelis who live in that land, but to also think about what does a Jewish future based in justice and equality and freedom and safety for everyone wherever they live, what does that look like? And I think in terms of the work I do around anti-Semitism is that I guess for a number of Jewish people who may be listening to this or might resonate with this is that we are seeing both an alarming rise in anti-Semitism and anti-Semitic ideologies alongside rises in Islamophobia and anti-migrant sentiment and sort of hostility towards the other in general. But we are also seeing at the same time very nefarious political forces capitalizing or misusing at times real Jewish fear and concerns around safety and security to attack or undermine democracy, to penalize and marginalize other minority communities, particularly Muslim and migrant communities. You know, we've seen this specifically very much in Europe. We've seen this in the US. We're seeing it here. And so to really think about how anti-Semitism and its political misuse are two sides of the same coin and need to be addressed in tandem. And so that's why I do the work I do, because I believe that all people, including Jewish people, obviously deserve to live in freedom and safety and thrive wherever they are. And we need to do this work in order to make sure that reality can happen.
And we're going to depart from the normal overs and unders just for this first segment. And we're both going to talk a bit about the recent anti-Semitic attacks and their political response.
Okay, yeah. So obviously, over the last few weeks, we have seen several arson attacks against Jewish communal buildings and properties in London. We've seen multiple synagogues, a Jewish charity, and two Hatzolah ambulances being attacked. And then, of course, last week in Golders Green, there was a stabbing. Two visibly Jewish people were attacked. The man was then arrested and charged with 3 counts of attempted murder because he also attacked and stabbed someone in South London earlier in the day. But this experience has been, I think, and this increased violent attacks across London have really contributed to an increased feelings of anxiety and fear for Jewish people for going about their daily lives, but also congregating in Jewish spaces, attending things that we would normally always attend, like synagogues or kosher restaurants, for example. And I think the thing to also name is that the Jewish community in the UK is very small. It's about 300,000 people, and many of us are connected to people who have been directly affected by these attacks. One of my friends works at the synagogue where there was a foiled arson attempt. These are really serious times. But I think the other thing I want to name is, as I said at the beginning, these attacks on Jewish communities are also coming at a time of deep political instability and inequality. and also at a time when we are seeing rising extremism and also rising far right politics. And I think that's something that we also need to acknowledge has been a little bit missing from some of the coverage, and particularly because these attacks are also coming alongside rising Islamophobia, rising anti-migrant sentiment, attacks on asylum seeker hotels. And for me, understanding that these things are interconnected doesn't diminish the severity of anti-Semitism, but rather it gives us a new way of thinking about it and hopefully a new way of trying to dismantle it as well.
Yeah, thanks for giving that overview. And there's so much for us to sort of talk about and get into. But I guess I did want to just sort of talk about the attacks first of all, and just like how shocking and horrible they are. If we go back to the Manchester attacks on the synagogue, like I think for any of us who are part of a minority or a group that's oppressed, and like some of us are part of visible minorities, and other people, can walk down the street and people don't necessarily know everything about their identity. But just like that, the thought of how terrifying it must feel to be a Jewish child going to school, or just, as you say, a member of a community that like isn't that big. Lots of the members of the community are, visibly able to be identified as Jewish. I just think like it's awful and it's a horrible thing to be happening in the UK. And you're right to say that like it's unfortunately part of a trend, like all sort of racially motivated hate crimes on the rise. But I do think, and especially like for those on the left, it is important to just sit with how awful and shocking and like nasty this is.
Yeah, and I think I want to say that, I feel very lucky actually to live in the UK as a Jewish person overall. And, I grew up in Australia. I actually grew up 10 minutes from Bondi. And that also um, is, in my mind is was a very idyllic place to grow up, and like felt very safe and welcomed as a Jewish person. And I think what we're seeing really for the first time in my life, I think I am much more noticing this tension. And I think that what I have been really heartened by is the solidarity that I've seen from other communities, and I actually particularly like Muslim friends and colleagues who've reached out, organizations like the Runnymede Trust to put out really clear statements of solidarity and support, the Together Alliance, who are seeing how this is part of fighting the broader sort of anti-democratic forces that are coming into our country right now, or in our country right now. And I think that to me has been really important to see. And I think that, the solidarity that Jewish people need is the same solidarity that all communities need when they are facing violence, which is that not only are you not alone, but our safety is inherently connected and intertwined. And we need to be thinking about how do we respond and work together to face off these threats of violence and extremism and polarization, and do what is often the necessary and difficult work of building out new alliances to take on these threats. That's not going to be easy. We might not always agree, but it is very important that whatever we do, it's based in this sense of shared safety, universalism, upholding human rights, solidarity, equality, equity, and taking on the systems and people who are benefiting from politics and climate of fear and violence, of which unfortunately there are many right now.
Yeah, and I think it is important to say, because when an attack like this happens, there are the people that get harmed. There is the community that like feels unsafe, feels anxious, doesn't want to walk down the street. And then there are also like copycat attacks and kind of ripples from the media coverage. So it is, yeah, a time when people feel and are less safe. And yeah, I think that as like left-wing people and people that believe that like inequality, the most important thing is just to, yeah, be showing care for a community that is under attack. I did want to talk about the political response though, because I
Yeah,
think
absolutely.
I sat through the Sunday shows like Laura Kuenssberg, and listened to Kemi Badenoch, and Keir Starmer and other people sort of immediately make these attacks about the Palestine protests. And like one of the reasons I wanted to have you on the show is if you listen to politicians from the big parties, there is the Jewish community, and there are the people that go on the Palestine demos who, if you believe Kemi Badenoch, are all like rabid anti-Semites, and there's not really any legitimate reason they're protesting. They're just like violent and awful. But then there's a category of people going on the Palestine demos that are Jewish, and it felt a bit like that people like you were just being erased from that conversation. There was this sort of binary setup that just didn't feel real.
What I think happens in these moments of crisis and violence is, and we've seen this happen the world over in the US and Europe, when there is a moment of particularly acute violence, like we've seen, there are politicians and political forces that want to capitalize on the real fear and concern that Jewish people have to make this about their other political agenda, which I think in the UK has been about shutting down rights to protest. And, it's important to note that we have seen numerous attempts by successive governments in the UK since October 2023 to try and shut down the Palestine solidarity marches. They've been labeled as hate marches. There's been attempts in Parliament to pass restrictions on protests. In fact, some are already still going through Parliament right now with amendments to the police and crime bill. And so this is a strategy that happens. And I think what's very dangerous about this strategy is that it actually positions the fight against anti-Semitism as in opposition to broader human rights struggles. The majority of people who go on Palestine solidarity marches do so because they are appalled by Israel's genocidal destruction in Gaza. That is the fact of the matter. And we need to make sure that we are holding with compassion and care the sort of feelings that a lot of Jewish people have at this time about our safety, our future, our right to thrive and live our lives just like anyone else does in the UK, and not have that conflated with a crackdown on human rights and a crackdown on the rights to protest. Because inadvertently, what that does is position the blame for that crackdown onto Jewish people. And that actually makes Jewish people a lot less safe. So it's really important that we don't let these political forces use us for those political aims that are very anti-democratic. And, our attacks on our own civil liberties, and again, I would say that there is no competition, in my view, from supporting Jewish people to be safe and thrive wherever they live, and also supporting Palestinian freedom. That's why I helped set up Nahmad. That's why I helped set up the Jewish bloc on the Palestine marches. Like, these things are actually intertwined and interconnected. They're not in competition. And all those politicians who are trying to suggest that they are, I think, are really not working in the interests of Jewish people. I think they're working in the interests of their own politics, where they might want to repress criticism of what the government is doing. For example, supporting Israel's destruction of Gaza, for example. I don't even know how we necessarily got to this point where it was like this attack happened, which is horrific. And we do need the government to have a good response on how they're going to keep Jewish people safe. And, initiatives could be helpful, actually, and could be beneficial around community safety-based programs and increased security, and those kinds of things could be good. But it is undermined by this attempt to politicize this as a way to attack the Palestine movement. And there is actually nothing about clamping down on the Palestine movements that necessarily keeps Jewish people safe. Like, it doesn't make any sense. And I think this also speaks to a lack of diversity of Jewish voices, and also, frankly, a lack of Palestinian voices being platformed by mainstream media outlets to talk about this. This is also constantly positioning Jews against Palestinians in the public discourse. It's this divide and rule strategy, which is very damaging and undermines both this fight against anti-Semitism, but also the fight for Palestinian human rights. Palestinians deserve freedom just as much as everyone else. I think the other thing to note about the response, which is important to say, is that this government has been responsible for furthering a lot of deeply racist policies against other minority communities. We had the prime minister quoting Enoch Powell, and he refused to call the far-right riots in 2024 Islamophobic, despite numerous mosques being attacked. So I think also when you see the government taking such a strong stance against anti-Semitism, which on some, of course they should, when they don't apply that to the fears and experiences of other minority communities in this country, it really does fuel this divide and rule politics and makes it harder actually for Jewish people to build allies with other communities. And that's why I think we can't actually rely on the state to do this work. Like, we have to do this in our communities, in our organizing, in our campaigning. And that feels fundamental to building a new vision of what shared safety and solidarity looks like in this country.
Yeah, and I think that the thing that sort of stays in my head a lot is that first Shami Chakrabarti report into anti-Semitism in the Labour Party many years ago. It's a deep cut, I'm sure. If you don't remember it, it's useless information in many ways. But there was an interesting, that name rings out. All those, I feel like you're probably one of the few people who be like, yeah, I can remember that report. But basically, the Shami Chakrabarti report into anti-Semitism in the Labour Party many years ago had a bit of a killer line, which was that anti-Semitism in the Labour Party is as prevalent in Labour as it is in the rest of the UK. And I think the other thing that happens when issues like anti-Semitism get politicised, they become a way for party leaders to grandstand, and, run attack ads on other parties and other candidates. It's like anti-Semitism is present in our societies, and it's not just politicians, and it's unfortunately not just these, people committing horrific violent acts. Like, there is an ambient anti-Semitism, like there is an ambient racism. And if you don't feel incensed by that and like want to address that and deal with that, then like you're not living your politics if you're on the left. Like, we have to be as terrified and angry and scared about these anti-Semitic attacks as we do injustices like that happen to other communities and that happen abroad. The risk then is that we buy into the false binaries and we don't include Jewish communities and anti-Semitism in our anti-racism. And as you say, there's lots of organizations that do not do that, like Runnymede. But I do think there is like a kind of lookout for the left in that regard.
Well, I think it's also, it's both morally important, obviously, to be thinking about these issues, but it's also a strategic imperative, right? Like the right will fill the vacuum if we, like they will with everything. That's what they do. And I think particularly at a time when right-wing politics is having far-right politics or reform politics is having a resurgence, it is important for us to be thinking about this both morally and strategically. I think this is also where the limitation of electoral politics comes in too. Like, this is also why it's so important. For me, electoral politics is another avenue through which we build the society in the future that we want. And that is one of a liberated world where everyone is free and equal. And I think that's why it's so important to have this organizing happening at the grassroots and in all of our communities to be able to then put pressure on political parties to adopt our agenda and our political framing. So that's also part of this too, I think.
So right over the top for the week is the Met Gala. So the 2026 Met Gala has just taken place, depending on when you're listening. For those who don't know what it is, it's a fundraiser for the Costume Institute in New York. And basically, this fundraiser has been taking place for like decades. And back in the 70s, a fashion editor, not Anna Wintour, got involved and started to help to sell tickets and like sat on the board. Fast forward a few years, Anna Wintour, notorious editor of US Vogue until recently, the inspiration behind The Devil Wears Prada and The Devil Wears Prada 2. Maybe we'll get to talk about that later.
No spoilers, Carys.
Yeah, no
No
spoilers, no
spoilers.
spoilers. Curates and chairs the annual Met Gala. And so what it's become is like a big red carpet event. They literally drape a red carpet down the steps of the Met Gala, and celebrities and like recording artists, like everyone, like actresses, models, like it's a big catwalk basically. And I got very excited about this year's Met Gala when the theme was announced because Beyonce was part of curating it. She has not attended for years. So in the run up to the 2026 Met Gala, I was gassed. I love a red carpet. I love like dissecting different dresses. I was like, Beyonce's back at the Met Gala. It's going to be amazing. Then this year's Met Gala got a new sponsor, Jeff Bezos of Amazon fame, and his wife, Lauren Sanchez, who was appointed honorary chair of the Met Gala and donated, we're not exactly clear, but I think upwards of $10 million to the event and fundraiser. I mean, the Met Gala was not unproblematic. It's a lot of rich people wearing designer clothes in a city where there's an affordability crisis and lots of people that live in poverty. But I just feel like by adding Jeff Bezos and Lauren Sanchez to the mix, it's really jumped the shark. But I don't know. What do you think? Have you followed this year's gala? Have you followed the dresses? Tell me what you think.
Yes, I have been following the Met Gala. I also want to give a shout out to my mum who called me to tell me that Annie Wintour was a big poser.
I love that they're on nickname terms, Annie.
Yeah, Annie. I was like, I think it's Anna, Mum, and I
Annie.
think posing is probably her job, but that's okay. Yeah, I mean, it is interesting. I think it's another example of how under creeping fascism we can't have nice things, right? Because obviously, whilst I would love to be able to just enjoy the Met Gala as I have for many years, I mean, I did love the bubble dress, I must say. It does I guess, spoil it somewhat to know that someone like Jeff Bezos, who is responsible for many terrible things in the world, is now sort of begging for friends by buying his way into this cultural phenomenon.
Such a beg. Such a
Big
beg.
friend. Unbelievable. But what I did think was really great actually was the alternative Met Gala that was put on by Amazon workers and the activists who went around the Met and put bottles of piss with Jeff Bezos's face on them underneath different statues, which I thought was just great.
Just as an
Uh,
explanation, that's because Amazon workers in the past have been told to piss in bottles rather than go to the toilet. And yeah, it's like obviously Jeff Bezos is like an evil billionaire, but he's kind of the archetypal like evil billionaire, like Lex Luthor. Like I
yes.
won't I won't spoil The Devil Wears Prada, but there's like arguably a Jeff Bezos character in the sequel. But yeah, Bezos is like he's comedy villain. Like he's mega rich. He's notoriously hates giving to charity unless it means he gets to like hobnob with celebrities. He pays as little tax as possible. He spends hundreds of millions of dollars on union busting efforts.
Yeah, and also
And
Amazon union organizer Chris Smalls was actually arrested for protesting outside the Met Gala too. So it's also, it is this perfect contrast between the sort of very glitzy, glamorous elite of society versus sort of the workers who are actually trying to say we don't want to have to piss in bottles so that Jeff Bezos can buy his way into the Met Gala. So my under the radar is again something quite disturbing and concerning, which is the huge number of deaths of Palestinians in the West Bank since October 2023. Over 1,000 Palestinians have been killed by Israeli forces since then, and it's very clear that Israel has been using the cover of its genocidal destruction in Gaza to not only commit unspeakable violence against Palestinians in the West Bank, but also ethnically cleanse them from their land. But what has particularly been part of this story, which I think a lot of people are aware of, is the uptick in violent settler attacks on Palestinian communities, and that is something that feels like it has ramped up significantly. Prior to this, there has been a huge amount of settler violence in the last years, but like particularly these kind of armed militias of radical settlers roaming the West Bank and using force and violence against these communities to essentially try and push them off their land has upticked. I think particularly it's important for us to be thinking about how Israel's ongoing wars in the Middle East, whether that's this new occupation of Lebanon, the war with Iran, obviously what it's continuing to do in Gaza, is really acting as this sort of cover or shield against attacks on Palestinians in other occupied territories that Israel controls. And for example, we know that 10 Palestinians were killed by settlers since the beginning of the Iran war, for example. And I think one thing that maybe is not always clear to understand, because it doesn't always get across, I think, in some of the reporting, but it's important for us to understand or frame settler violence and the attacks on Palestinian communities by settlers by the army as state policy. The settlers in some ways are doing the dirty work of the Israeli government, who want to control all this land, who do want Palestinians to be pushed into big urban areas so that they can control areas like the South Hebron Hills, for example, where there are already a number of radical settlements. And that this is something that, is very much part of the state apparatus of Israel and needs to be addressed as much as it would in any other place.
yeah, and for those who sort of aren't as familiar, there are kind of two Palestinian territories: Gaza, which obviously people heard about and saw a lot of, after October the 7th with the genocide, and then the West Bank is like, so they're two bits of land that aren't connected, unhelpful, and the West Bank is based. Well, I'm going to summarize it, and you can tell me if I've got it wrong. The borders of the West Bank are constantly shrinking because there are state-sponsored settlers who are sort of moving into Palestinian territory and kind of building homes and communities so that land that is sort of legally under international law Palestinian sort of effectively becomes part of Israel.
Yeah, I mean, I think what I would say is that all of the territory that Israel controls is about, I think, pushing Palestinians out of their homes and their land, and whether that started with the Nakba and moved into the occupation in 67. But yeah, the Israeli state wants to control all of this land. And one of the ways they do that, whether that's through declaring certain areas of the West Bank military training zones or firing zones as a way to force Palestinians to leave their land, whether that's about putting up certain kinds of infrastructure. This is one of the ways they do that. And of course, for Palestinians, for Jews living in the same place, living side by side, there are two different kinds of laws in the West Bank. So Palestinians are subject to military law. Israeli citizens who live there are subject to civilian law. Israeli civilians who live in settlements also have the same access to resources and amenities as they would if they were living in 48 territory. So really, actually, I think what this is also showing us is how also even something like a two-state solution is very much beyond the realms of possibility these days. And in fact, in some ways that also like pushing that kind of agenda can also give cover to a lot of this violence because it's not talking about it in the reality of what we are facing. But I wanted to draw up two particular events that I think are important to talk about. One is there is a village called Khair in the South Hebron Hills, or in Masafiyata, which is the Palestinian name for the territory. And Khair is a Bedouin Palestinian community. They're originally in the Nakab or Negev in desert and were forced to move into the West Bank in 1948 and then were occupied from 1967 by Israel. And this is a community of which I've spent a lot of time in through doing Jewish-Palestinian solidarity work in the West Bank. I'm part of a number of different Jewish activists from around the world who spent a lot of time there. And the village of Khair plays a really special role, I think, in the existence of resistance and challenge to occupation and apartheid for Palestinians and for many of Jewish folks around the world. And during the Iran war, this past war in February, or the Iran-Israel war, settlers used the opportunity when children were banned from going to school because of the attacks to erect a barbed wire fence that blockaded these children from being able to access their school. And so the children and activists from the community led a protest to this barbed wire fence which was put up by settlers and then being patrolled by the Israeli army. And when they reached the fence as their protest, the army shot tear gas and stun grenades at these children, little children, primary school age children. And I think that for me is a real microcosm of the daily indignity and violence that so many of these communities are facing, and where, for many of them, it's going to become unlivable. And the other thing I wanted to say, which I think is the reason that I do this, one of the reasons I do this work and why it's so important to me, is through these relationships. And last summer, one of the main activists from Khair, his name was Auda Hathleen. He was 26 years old, and he was murdered by a settler who was trying to break a water pipe that provided water to the village. The settler's called Yinon Levi. He was actually sanctioned by the British government for being an extremist, but he has never been arrested or charged with Auda's murder. And he continues, as many of his compatriots do, to taunt that community every day. And so I think that one of the reasons this is important to talk about is that, I think, there's been hundreds of thousands of Audas who have been killed in the last 3 years and beyond, but really understanding and keeping the fight alive for many of these communities who just want to live on their land and go to school and raise their children and, be as we all do, and really keeping those stories alive in our discourse and in our work as people abroad who care about these issues.
Yeah, it's a really important story, and it had been under my radar until you sort of shared some of the context with me. I guess it also underlines the importance of being able to peacefully protest about things like this and draw attention to them in countries like the UK. What do you think? I mean, aside from a general lack of Palestinian voices in the media, why do you think so much of this stuff flies under the radar?
I mean, I think a lot of it is racism. I think actually, that people expect Palestinians to be oppressed or to be killed or to exist under occupation. And it is our responsibility as activists who fight for freedom for everyone to not let that reality happen. I think what's also becoming more difficult is the more you understand about what Israel is doing in the West Bank, the more you see it as part of a system and it is not a few bad apples. And I think that what is challenging is that there are attempts by a lot of politicians and sort of pro-Israel advocates, when we see this level of violence, to say, oh, this is an anathema, this is an anomaly. And actually it's not. It's state policy. This community has been living under occupation since 1967. It was expelled from their land in 1949. This is their story. It's not their only story, but Ben Gvir wasn't in government in the 70s, 80s, 90s, 2000s, right? This is not just a Smotrich and Ben Gvir reality, even though that has definitely accelerated that violence. This is something that was also acceptable to numerous Israeli governments because it's part of a plan for taking territory.
I want to say a really big thank you to Magnus and Soren, who became paying Patreon supporters this week. This podcast only exists because a few hundred people choose to pay for it each month. That's it. A few hundred people donate a few pounds each on Patreon, and we can make this show for thousands of you ad-free. I'll be honest, right now those few hundred people only cover our basic production costs. We need more supporters so the podcast can continue to exist and grow. If you like Over the Top Under the Radar and you want us to keep making it, please become a Patreon supporter today. The Patreon community gets the warm glow of supporting the podcast, and it also gets a bonus episode of the show each week, a weekly behind-the-scenes newsletter, and access to the Over Under WhatsApp community. Go to patreon.com/overthetop under the radar. If you choose to support us, it means everyone gets the show every week ad-free, and you will be supporting independent left-wing media, not beholden to shareholders or billionaire owners who are lame. My on the radar is another rich people story, but it's sort of a good news rich people story. And I want to give a shout out to Alex from the Over Under WhatsApp community, who's a Patreon supporter, who shared this story in the Over Under WhatsApp community, which is how it came onto my radar, which is that this week, the Samsung family, so a South Korean dynastic family, like think Succession. There is literally a Succession storyline if you want to go deep on them. Their relative Lee Kun-hee died in October 2020, and this week they made the final installment on their inheritance tax bill. So inheritance tax in South Korea is at 50%. Sensible amount, I would say. So that means that the Samsung family paid 12 trillion won, or £6 billion in 6 installments over 5 years. They had a payment plan. How reasonable. It's the largest settlement in South Korean history. And like that total payment is 1.5 times like the 2024 inheritance tax revenue. So it's a good news story. It barely got picked up in English language media. There is a story on the BBC, which is what Alex shared with the Over Under WhatsApp community. But I did just want to give a quote from one of the Samsung family that said, "Paying taxes is a natural duty of citizens." So the Lee family's combined net worth is more than 45 billion. 45 billion. They paid about 8 billion in those 6 installments in dollars, but their wealth has also more than doubled in the last year because it's Samsung and, you know, AI, chips, tech.
I think they also have that new flip phone too.
Oh yeah, I'm not getting it, but probably a Gen Z will. I don't know.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's the phones, the TVs, everything. It's Samsung. I mean, there's like so much interesting stuff about that. Like even the sort of these like wealthy families in Korea, like the LG family is another one. They also had a big inheritance tax bill, but it flew under the radar, and I wanted to talk about it for a couple of reasons. Like, number one, so weird in this world where like so much of our media is owned by billionaires that we don't hear about billionaires paying tax. Just seems such a strange coincidence. But also like it's just a sort of low drama, real life rebuttal to the idea that we can't tax rich people. South Korea is taxing rich people. It's taxing their wealth. It's been doing it for ages. It is one of the highest inheritance tax rates, but I think Japan's is higher. And it's no drama. And like, I'm not going to lie, the LG family did try and recoup some of their inheritance tax bill, but like rich people pay inheritance tax when people die. In fact, the South Korean government at the moment is looking to like tweak their inheritance tax laws because right now the amount you pay is like tied to the share price of your company. And so people are kind of like trying to like push the share price down to reduce the amount of inheritance tax. The government's like, now we need to look into that. We need to tighten that one up. So South Korea is taxing the rich and it's working out pretty well for them. We should be talking about it more. That's my under the radar. Had this flown on your radar? What do you think of Samsung?
It hadn't flown under my radar, but I obviously fully support this. And I think it also shows, you know, why, if you are also that wealthy, paying high rates of tax don't actually impact you that much. You know, even if they paid £6 billion in tax, but they're worth 45 billion, I don't think they're going to be losing sleep at night about whether they're, you know, going to have a dip in their quality of life. I think there is a bigger question around whether having that amount of wealth in general when you're alive is moral. And I think that's another question that comes alongside the inheritance tax. Like maybe the inheritance tax question is the first hurdle for us to be having the bigger conversation around whether people with a 45 billion pound fortune should actually be able to control that amount of wealth. And again, this comes back to the Bezos question around, particularly at this time when, you know, money seems to be so much more embroiled in politics in a way that perhaps it hasn't in sort of modern times previously. That's another question I have around it, but it's definitely a good thing. And I'm glad they paid their tax bill. And I agree around, you know, no drama. We're just going to do this. And this idea of thinking about the benefits of broader society as well as to why tax is a good thing. And I think, you know, we do need to be improving our messaging around why people should pay tax, right?
Yeah. And I think you're right. Like it's it is a laughable amount of money for a family to have, like more than they can ever spend in their lifetime. And like 100, like they should not have even retained that much of the amount of wealth that they've got. Like it's ridiculous. And like, I'm not going to say this properly because I do not speak Korean, but they are part of this chaebol structure, which are these like big like companies, like dynastic, normally family run. So like LG is one, Samsung's another, big mega successful corporations. And like one of the other consequences of the chaebol and like companies like Samsung, these like big dynasties having all this money, is that they also have concentrated political power. They have loads of influence over South Korean politics. So like it is just the case that we do not want large concentrations of wealth, because people with lots of wealth then want lots of power so they can keep their wealth. So like I personally would love to tax the Samsungs even more, but I think that the hysteria that we get when someone like, Zach Polanski or any other left-leaning politician says, what about if we just like had a wealth tax? Or what about if farmers had to pay the same amount of inheritance tax as everyone else in the UK? And you get the like wailing and gnashing of teeth of like, we'll be impoverished, or like everyone will leave. And it's like, or not. Or people will just pay. And like maybe there should be social incentives for them to pay. Maybe they should, feel like proud of paying. And also maybe government should be about getting really nerdy about how to recoup tax. Like I love this thing of like, because the stock price is part of how you calculate the inheritance tax bill. I love that like Korean officials are being like, these guys are getting a discount because they're pushing down the stock price. They have to pay as much tax. Let's deal with that. Like, let's tackle it. And I think I do just also find in a world where we're constantly being told by these like mealy-mouthed politicians who promise absolutely nothing other than that they'll be really mean to immigrants, being like, well, we couldn't possibly afford to, like have pensioners heat their homes, or we couldn't possibly afford, for free school meals for all children. Like there's just no money. And then meanwhile, we have to watch people like Jeff Bezos stunting on us, like renting Venice for his wedding, like abusing workers in the UK, giving them no rights, like making it hard
My
for
mum
them to
has strong opinions
unionize.
on that too.
Can't wait to hear them.
Yeah.
Sidebar, if you want to come on the show, Mum
Yeah.
Hilton, just like slide in my DMs. But it's like, it's also a little bit like, it's
Yeah.
quite mad thing when you're like, I could see like Jeff Bezos literally spaffing his money up the wall on like a rocket to space that Katy Perry gets to go on. You're telling me that you can't afford to do anything. The bar's in the ocean to be a decent billionaire, isn't it? Literally, the Samsung's just paid a
Some
tax
might
bill.
say there's no such thing, Carys, but I agree. The bar is in the
Yeah. Maybe it's an oxymoron, but it's like, yeah, it really when you're up against Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos, all you have to do is pay a tax bill on time, and you seem like a pretty good human. Well, I think that's all we've got time for. Thank you so much, Em, for coming on. Where can people find you and your work?
So you can follow Narmod at NarmodUK on Instagram or on Blue Sky, and you can also donate to support our work. I'm on Instagram at mhilton91, and I write a bit. I'll be around writing things, hopefully, in the coming months and years, so you can find me there.
We'll link to all of those wonderful things in the show notes. Thank you for listening. If you sign up to support us at patreon.com/over the top under the radar, you can hear my bonus conversation with Em.